Thank you very much for coming and listening to us this morning, especially to those of you who may have been in this very room for the Nuit de la Démocratie last night until midnight. So thanks very much. My name is Martin Tasneem. I'm an investment partner with the Media Network, which is a funder in the space. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about what I think is this really important, exciting, nascent topic in our space, and then introduce your panel and have what I'm sure will be a very lively conversation. So, what we're here to discuss today is transparency and accountability of decisions made by computers, effectively, algorithmic decisions. So you may say, hang on a second, this is the Open Government Partnership, why are we having this conversation? I think we're having this conversation really because of the growth of the open government and the open data movement. So I think the open data movement has really seen three phases. There was the first phase, which is the more evangelical phase of the movement, when all of us from sort of late 2000s on wanted and needed to push for as much available, accessible, comparable information as possible, and we should continue doing that, and this is an everyday struggle, an everyday fight. The second one, which is where we are now, which is caring deeply about who uses that information. We want the information to be useful, to be helpful, and to be used. Now, my sense is, and we're a little bit, hopefully, ahead of the curve on this to be able to catch it as it comes our way. The third will be concerns about not only the positive, but also the negative implications of a data-driven society. So what I would really love as a success for this session today is for all of you to come out at the end of the 50 minutes having a much clearer understanding of not why we should hold algorithms accountable, but how. So the question I've been asking myself for the past year is, it's fairly clear that we want decisions that are data-driven to be as transparent as possible, as accountable as possible. The big question is how. And I've been a transparency activist for 15 years now. I have never seen a field, a space like this. And the reason I've never seen it is for the following reason. I've interviewed countless people, and people who agree with the general premise, which is that data-driven algorithmic decisions should be fair and they should be non-discriminatory. People who agree with that, they're in the same tent. They disagree radically as to whether transparency is a solution or not, right? So on one side, you'll have people arguing very persuasively, and we saw it yesterday with the session L'audit citoyen des algorithmes. Yesterday evening, they'll argue passionately that algorithmic decisions need to be as transparent, as answerable as possible, and others will say, well, hang on a second, we want them to be answerable, but we don't think the transparency is necessarily the main answer here. And I'll be talking to the panel about this in a second. So what are we talking about? The scope is huge, right? We care, all of us as a community care deeply about empowering people in the decision-making processes that impact their lives. So we're talking about very concrete things, decisions that impact where my kids go to school, decisions that impact where my wife will go to hospital to deliver our child, decisions that impact where I may go to hospital, my parents and others. So at the core of part of this open government movement is citizen empowerment in the distribution and the allocation of public resources. When those decisions are made by algorithms, when those decisions are data-driven, how do we ensure that those decisions are accountable? So if you are the recipient, if you're on the receiving end of a decision which you feel is unfair, which you feel goes counter to your interests, but the decision was made by an algorithm, effectively, what's your recourse? So I think there's two really important things here. One of them is the ethics of that decision, and the other one, fundamentally, the accountability. So I've, as I mentioned, spent a bit of time researching this, and my sense is that within this field, people are grouped into a number of different sort of coalitions. There are people who are very concerned about transparency, others who are very concerned about the ability to audit the algorithms, others who are very concerned about the policies, the laws that we'll put in place. So we'll talk about this with the panel and then opening up for questions if that works for everyone. So enough from me. We have a very distinguished diverse and I think really, really fascinating panel here. We have a mixture. We've got expertise working very closely with business. We've got a lot of expertise around surveillance, data collection, expertise on design, expertise around open data. I think you will all introduce yourselves much better than I could introduce you. So if I can start with Ali to my left, if you just grab a microphone and then pass it on, just a quick introduction on who you are, where you work, and why you're here today. What interests you?
Hello. Hey, my name is Ali. I work at the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. in the United States. We have a couple of remote individuals, but the main operation of our work is in DC. CDT is pretty well known in the privacy space in Washington for being really nuanced in how we address technology policy issues and for really thinking about how to promote innovation in technology as well as people's rights and looking out for individuals. We try not to use the word consumer, but basically a version of consumer protection that doesn't sound quite as patronizing. We haven't come up with an actual term for that yet, so we just explain it every time. Yeah, so we've been working on what we call digital decisions for a couple of years now. And our project is really focused on trying to help companies who intend to do good things with data-driven decisions do so in a way that we think is fair, at least in the process sense. Yeah, I am excited to talk to you guys today and with my co-panelists about what transparency and auditing looks like in a way that it still encourages innovation and perhaps empowers individuals as well as sort of institutions to evaluate their own work and their own place in the world.
Thank you. Thanks, Ali. Nigel.
Hi, Nigel Shadbolt. I'm a professor of artificial intelligence at the University of Oxford and also a co-founder and chairman of the Open Data Institute in London. So my interest in this is long-standing. I've been involved in building decision-based systems for almost 40 years. And the question there is how scrutable they can be. I think it's an absolutely essential one. And of course, in a sense, programs are another form of data. So we have to ask ourselves questions about what should and shouldn't be the limits on revealing that stuff. Also work around issues associated with anonymization, which I think may crop up in this context too.
Thanks, Nigel. Sarah.
Good morning. My name is Sarah Gold. I'm a designer. I'm director of an organization called IF. We are Projects by IF, the design studio, and Research by IF, a non-profit research arm. We are working on various projects producing products and services that put people in control of data and help organizations see the positives in being more accountable for how they use it. We're coming across automated decision-making and all sorts of black boxes in our work. Algorithms are just one of those black boxes we're coming across that we need to try and make more understandable by people, but also focus on what they need to know from transparency too.
Thanks. Gus.
Good morning. My name is Gus Hossain. I'm the Executive Director of Privacy International, which is a London-based charity that works across the world with NGOs and policymakers to seek better solutions around surveillance and data governance issues. Our approach to this domain is we are looking particularly at the area of data exploitation, where there's an excessive generation, excessive collection, and then the mining of that data, and what do we do about all of that, and how do we even begin to understand what is control, what is transparency. And so that's why I'm just fascinated to be on this panel, because the diversity of expertise is representative of the fact that we don't know the answers to these questions yet. We don't know how we're supposed to stop or solve or remedy any of these problems when it comes to data. And the underlying theme to what I'll be discussing this morning is we haven't even solved that when it didn't involve data. How are we going to do it now that it involves data and algorithms?
Brilliant. Thanks, Gus. So my first question to the panel is about transparency. Is it just really actually that simple? Should we just have transparent algorithms and we will understand, they will be answerable, we'll be able to see what goes on, we'll have transparency of the source code, and that will solve it? Is this really what we need? What do you think?
I would say no. I think that if you're thinking about publishing an algorithm doesn't get you very far, and I think Google's PageRank is a pretty good example. The algorithm for PageRank, the equation of PageRank is public, is published. That's not sort of what makes it powerful, and that's not what poses issues for folks. The underlying sort of data that's powering it, the things it has learned from the place it holds in our society is really what gives those decisions so much power. And I would really focus on, for me personally, I would really think about the last one as being the place to make an intervention, not so much in trying to force the algorithm to be accountable to itself, but to force us to be accountable for how we rely on data and how we think about data as being sort of an arbiter of truth, right? We think that something is data-driven, therefore it must have some unique power that should override any other logical or principled value that we might hold. Publishing an algorithm isn't necessarily going to undermine that belief, and from my point of view, that belief is really causing a lot of some of the negative outcomes that you're seeing with automated decision-making. So I would say publishing the algorithm is not going to get you very far.
But what does that mean in practice, though? I mean, to say that we should be less reliant on data in society at a times when we're becoming more and more reliant, I mean, how would that work in practice? It seems a little quixotic.
So yeah, I guess reliant is maybe not quite the right word. I think we should be more skeptical of what data tells us. And I have an example. I was at a meeting in the United States with some folks who were trying to answer the question, when does the government have an obligation or the ability to override privacy in order to intervene and sort of use people's data in the event of an emergency, right? And so the example that was given in the conversation was Hurricane Katrina. When does the government have a right to say, we're going to go to the hospitals and get all of people's medical records and just give them to us because we need to figure out where we need to drop medical supplies because people are stranded by the hurricane. We need to know where we should be strategically dropping insulin in this emergency. And they asked me, is that right? And I thought, I have to think about it. It's really complicated because it sort of depends on how you define emergency, and there's actual rules around this that I don't know. In any case, I went home and I talked to my father, who's a physician, and I said, this is a really interesting question. He's a physician and a curmudgeon, so it's really useful to ask him privacy questions. And he looked at me and he said, insulin's not that expensive. Just drop it everywhere. We were trying to use data to solve a problem that it didn't need to be solved with data. The role that data plays is often to further empower the value of efficiency that we hold in problem solving. But efficiency is not always the best way to solve a problem. It's an obligation that we think we have, and data feeds into that, but maybe it's something that needs to be questioned.
Still strikes me, I take your point, it still strikes me that we have an issue when the decision has been taken and you are the recipient of it. So for example, in the case of predictive policing or in the case of data that's used to track recidivism, the potential of recidivism. So in Chicago, in the States, there was a study done whereby the police has been using numericals, numbers, a bit like the movie with Tom Cruise, Minority Report. So the police is using numbers which give all of us a number as to our likelihood of committing a future crime. And that number is then used as one of the elements by the judge to decide on the sentencing. So in that case, I think, I take your point in terms of, should we rely less on data? But on accountability, I'm still curious. So Nigel, you've done a lot of work around artificial intelligence. How does the transparency piece work? The AI people I speak to, partly what they tell me is, look, if you have to sacrifice accuracy for comprehensibility, right, to be able to understand it, that will never go, that will never fly, because we need to be as accurate as possible when it comes to these decisions, which will bleed into AI in the future, and we need to find a way that is, they're comprehensible, but they're also accurate. So is transparency the answer? What do you think?
Well, I think in general, transparency is a very good default. It's what's powered most of modern science and engineering. If I get a paper and I haven't been presented with the method by which the results stand, in particularly in computer science, I've got no way to judge whether this is kind of reasonable, fair, an advance, a step forward, or whatever. So in general, I think it's a good default to assume. And in certain other areas, we're kind of getting to that position. So if I take, predictive policing is one, credit rating is another, where there is established law. And actually in the States, the Federal Trade Commission spends quite a lot of time worrying about whether or not credit decisions are in some sense not just fair, are they discriminatory, and there is machinery in place. And I think that it's entirely proper to ask large organizations who are making significant decisions that affect a person's outcomes in life or feasibility to say, what's the basis? What's the basis of that decision? Now, your issue about accuracy, there's a bit of a, I think there's a bit of a red herring, as we'd say in this. Lots of algorithms are entirely precise. There's a lot of reasoning in AI which uses rule-based systems, theorem proving. I can name a whole list of methods and techniques which have a degree of scrutability which is really very helpful. There is a class of modern machine learning which people get excited about, neural networks, where the issue of explication is trickier because essentially they are very complex computational equations. Essentially what you get offered up is a very large weight matrix. There isn't much insight in that. But that's not to say that you can't derive principles and maxims by which you can put that algorithm to the test. You can verify and validate that it is giving you a reasonable set of outputs without necessarily having a complete, a simply explained characterization of why that decision is. And that's where the tension is going to be, I think.
But if you verify and validate, is it about a certain type of code within the algorithm that enables you to question it, or is it about transparency? And if it's transparency, I think partly the discussion on transparency is transparency of what? Of the source code? Of the input data? What are we asking for?
Well, that's again, a good question. I mean, in some cases, the source code can be less than transparent itself. What you're looking for is an abstraction, an intermediate description of how the algorithm is working. And there are reasons, perhaps, that you might not always want to release the pure source code. I think those decisions about where we put the audit process or the accountability process, I'm sure we're going to see the emergence. People say AI is going to put loads of people out of business. You wait and see the number of new accounting and actuarial jobs that will emerge when the class of question is, prove that this algorithm is giving me a fair and reasonable output. How can I audit the code at different levels of abstraction to understand what it's doing? We're very aware of this already in safety critical software. We don't allow any kind of software to fly our planes. It goes through very tedious and very exhaustive testing. And even then, we end up with software which sometimes contains the seeds of its own destruction, as we've seen in medical software.
Thank you. So you've heard it here. Tell your kids, algorithmic auditor is the job of the future, the industry of the future. Sarah, I'm really keen to ask you. So from, what we really push for at ON, at the Media Network, is we want people to be empowered. We want people to be able to be in control of the data that impacts their lives. And at times it strikes me that these decisions made by algorithms can be quite disempowering, right? And so on the design side, what do you think? How can does transparency help people to be empowered? What do you think? It's a design question?
I think that design has a real legitimacy in this space because when you think about transparency, this is not going to work just through the command line, right? We're going to need accessible services that people can look at, access, and whether that's citizens or individuals working in third-party organizations or kind of civil justice groups. There's a whole range of users, I think, of transparent systems. And but I think that ultimately the transparency has to be meaningful. I think otherwise, if we just look at transparency by itself, that creates all kinds of new kind of power imbalances and also bad behaviors too. As you were talking about before, Ali, you can get metrics that are really not what you should be working towards or valuing. So transparency can create really bad behavior too. And so I think whatever we do, we have to make sure that transparency meets the needs of the users. And I think design has a large part to play in finding out who are the users of transparency, who are the people that will be looking at the accountability, finding out what the algorithm has been set out to do. I think that is largely unknown right now, and I think we need a larger research area to understand who the users of transparency are so that we can mitigate the risks but also be more confident about the benefits.
Great, thank you. So look, Gus, Gus, scare us here a little bit. We're having a good policy conversation. We're looking for the answers. Every time I speak to Gus Hussain from Privacy International, I come back sort of slightly scared and slightly worried. So you run a data exploitation program. What is it? We should be worried about our thermostats taking over our lives? What is it? What's going on?
Yeah, well, first, I want to reconfigure the algorithm of where I'm sitting. It's hard to speak at the end of this expertise. And so it's hard to say something that's actually going to advance it any further than these amazing speakers. But transparency, let me just correct two issues. And I'm very conscious of the fact that we have a professor of artificial intelligence on this panel. But in this discourse, as policy folks, we tend to think that there's input, a thing called an algorithm, and output. All of those are very dynamic in this actual space. There is no algorithm, per se, except where the algorithm is simple. Where we're getting with artificial intelligence and machine learning and intelligent systems, there's no stasis point that we can audit, that we can look at and say, let's make that transparent, and we will have understanding of the world. Similarly, the inputs and outputs will always result in different outcomes at a moment in time. And so it's a shifting domain. And so just calling for transparency introduces challenges. But let me use an example. About a month ago, a company called Admiral Insurance in the United Kingdom announced that in order to help lower premiums, particularly of younger drivers, they're going to introduce a new service that if you as that younger driver gives Admiral access to your Facebook data, it will analyze that data and decide whether or not you deserve a lower price. And it caused an immediate furore, people saying it's unfair, and within hours, Admiral had to pull back. Facebook said they're not going to allow Admiral Insurance to have access to this data, even though Facebook allows countless other organizations to do exactly the same thing. But what was most interesting was the transparency element that only came out later, which was what was Admiral going to do with this data? And what it was is they were going to analyze Facebook posts to see what kind of person you are, not necessarily through your belief system, but how you articulate yourself. One example they gave was, if you say, let's meet up tonight, that means to them that you are an evasive character. You can't commit to something. But if you say, let's meet up at 6:30 tonight, that means that you're a responsible character, and as a result, your insurance premium should be lower. And let me get to my point, though, other than how ridiculous that is. It will lead to the changing of behavior. And that's what's dangerous about transparency in decision-making. Decision-making up until now has been almost, well, first we've known when it's taking place, and we've known how to conform with it, how to behave properly. But if this decision-making gets thrown across society, because data is across society, it's going to compel us to behave differently and to be more articulate about what time we're meeting up at night, in the most banal example. But I don't know if you've heard about the innovations in China with its Sesame credit system, where it's essentially trying to do this on a societal scale to promote good behavior and allow credit that comes out of that, and then access to government services. That's the world we're building, and particularly if you go after transparency, we're essentially telling people how to behave.
Yes, please, yeah.
So what you described when you change behavior, companies would call gaming the system, right? And government would say, we can't publish this because people will game the system. And it will create this problem where we can no longer get accuracy because now people are cheating our ridiculous metrics, and sort of a self-perpetuating problem. What's really interesting is if you go back to Nigel's example of credit scores in the United States, FICO has published a really rough percentage of what goes into your credit score. This doesn't cause people to game the system because the things that they're putting in the credit score are actually really good metrics for whether or not you're a good credit risk, and they encourage good behavior from the credit system. In fact, the credit scores may be a little bit too conservative. They're so robust, right? So there's a civil rights concern on the other side too. But if you take that same logic, right? If you say credit scores worked because we published the rough equation, and it turns out that if you do pay your bills on time, that's good behavior, and we want people to game that. What if you took that same logic and applied it to predictive policing? The police will tell you, we can't say what determines who goes on the terrorist watch list because people will game the system. But ideally, to game the system would be to not be a terrorist, right? And so that'd be a good outcome. So the metrics, the things that go into it, if they're robust, if the system is good and strong, it shouldn't be gameable, at least not in these really important contexts, right? What advertisements you see and things like this maybe matter less. But certainly whether or not you're deemed a terrorist, we should game that. You shouldn't be a terrorist.
So look, I'm curious for Nigel, this is a really important point, because in a way, is it that this is just bad data science and the people who are hiding behind a veil of opacity are effectively scared that they will be shown to be peddling unscientific nonsense, and that actually if it's robust data science and that you open it up, then you will lead to the positive outcomes that Ali's talking about. So Nigel, is it as simple as that? Is it just a question of strong data science and then we'll be able to show it and it will lead to positive incentives?
Yeah, would that it were. It's always more. I mean, I think Gus makes a good point about as well about the essential dynamism a lot of these systems, and the fact that they aren't just one system. Often it's a number of modules. There are humans making interpretive decisions along the way. But also, you would just be surprised how boneheaded some of the overall decision-making is that passes for kind of various forms of retail science. And well-known things like the tendency for recommender systems, these things that watch what you buy and how you buy to drive us all into these stereotype buckets and have no capacity to see the full range of in which humans express themselves. So I mean, there are good examples, I think, where we are beginning to see what balanced practice is. Again, various countries, jurisdictions have extensive ways in which they try and understand and assess the utility of whether particular drugs do or don't work. Now, I'm not talking about clinical trials. I'm talking about the expert panels that sit there thinking, can we or should we afford this drug for this particular condition? What's the evidence tell us? So NICE is the example in the UK. And there are agonizing decisions here about what those input numbers are telling you, what the balance of probabilities is, how is a decision made. And they're not easy, but at least the argument could be had, the pros and cons made. There will be lots of limit conditions where the complexity of the algorithms apparently being used are very hard to fully understand, and the unintended consequences of conditions that haven't been encountered yet will find the system out. And we've seen this in high-frequency trading systems and a number of other contexts. But I can't help but say that in general, if you want to have a hope of kind of getting some sense of systematicity, then having reproducible method and transparent method is a good place to start.
Okay, so look, I can't help to think, I'll pass it in just 1 second. There's one thing that's puzzling me, that's puzzled me for a long time. So this is the Open Government Partnership. We have government officials, civil society in the room. What's the difference? Because we're jumping around a little. We're talking about algorithmic decision-making by Facebook. We're talking about government decisions. We're talking about other private sector decisions that impact important areas of our lives, private health insurance companies. Is there, and if there is, what is the difference between an algorithm which is deployed by government, it could be having contracted a private company to do so. What's the difference between government using these techniques, using public money, and the private sector using the techniques? Is it a government-private sector distinction? I'm sure there's colleagues in the room who'll say, well, look, if it's government, you should be able to FOI it. You should use freedom of information laws. Is that the difference? Is that the lens? Should we use a lens which is a public interest test case? Should we say, like Cathy O'Neill, hugely recommend her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, is it a question of there are certain types of algorithms, whether they're government or not, public or private, they impact your lives in a massive way, right? Finance, insurance, and those are the ones that we should scrutinize, and government should legislate, government should regulate those specific types of algorithms. And that I just don't have the answer to that.
Well, the French claim they do, because the French have just passed in their République numérique, they've got a clause around algorithmic accountability and making quite strong claim to try and anticipate just that question. I don't think the duty of care should be any less, and possibly more, on a government than it should on a private company. I can't see that why you wouldn't want to know. And there are big arguments about bed blocking, bed waiting, prioritization of surgical procedures, educational choice options, school catchment areas. You can think of endless numbers of areas where the issue is precisely how are these decisions being made? And the public interest is, well, how are they being made?
Sarah, you wanted to jump in.
I was just going to mention that I think that transparency of automated decision-making is not, it can't just focus on like that decision-making process. It also has to be like the governance structure in the organisation itself and a whole bunch of other things to do with the organisation. So transparency basically throws grenades everywhere in an organization, because it can't just be this single black box we've identified because algorithms are like, you know, a really hot news right now. It's actually the black box of an organization too, I think, that we need to think about.
Is it a question of who's responsible in the organization? Is it a question of having someone who is, I mean, a lot of the issues, I talk to technologists about this, and they basically say, look, this is not my job, you know, I'm not the one responsible for this. Should all companies have ethics of algorithms TARs? Is that the issue?
I don't think that any one person can be held responsible. I think that when, you know, I have a lot of friends who are developers, some really, really smart people, but everyone's just doing their best. Everyone's kind of guessing sometimes, going on Stack Overflow, trying things out. So I don't think that I think it has to be about teamwork. I think there has to be like principles that you're working towards. I think there do need to be better review places in place, particularly for shipping code, and different kinds of reviews where you're not just judging against the efficiency of a script, but also the fairness of it. But I don't think it can be one person.
Thanks. I'll just get to Gus quickly, and then I'm keen to open up to questions. Look, Gus, help us out on the auditing piece. I mean, I really struggle with it. I was talking to fantastic investigative journalist, Julia Angwin at ProPublica, who uncovered the piece I was talking about the issue of these data trackers that track your recidivism rate, right? That give you a numerical which says you are likely to commit a future crime or not. We only know about this because of the great work of an investigative journalist. So should we be, you know, empowering hundreds of thousands of investigative journalists to figure out what's happening? Otherwise, we just don't know. And if we don't know, we can't find the solution. And I struggle with that because realistically, we're not going to be empowering hundreds of thousands of journalists with data science capabilities to really get it. So from your perspective at Privacy International, what's your take on that? How do we scale it up?
Yeah, we struggle with exactly that problem. Do we hire a whole new band of investigators who actually have degrees in mathematics in order to figure out what's actually going on? But on top of the investigation staff we have right now, who are phenomenal journalistic-like investigators, the challenge that even Julia faces is to even know that there is decision-making going on, to even know that there's an algorithm going on that's actually in place, or an automated process in place, and to even know what's feeding that, and to then see the outputs. Again, this is a larger problem than just automated systems. It is decision-making in society. And if you look at how, in the past few years, the discourse of inequality has become so dominating in people's mindsets, and if you think about decision-making, it's about the decision of where resources shall or shall not go. At the moment, it's really just about advertising and where advertising shall go. But when that becomes more about what I have access to as a human being, whether it's a citizen, a consumer, or an individual, that's when we're going to see a massive pushback. And there'll be no ability for us to look in to say, we know what's going on and we know where the injustice is arising.
I think this is a fundamental point for GDPR.
I think there's like already that inequality. So we've just been doing studies on free Wi-Fi, which increasingly is being rolled out everywhere because it's a piece of infrastructure for society. But because of business needs that change the technical that make use of the technical standards of free Wi-Fi, we've got free Wi-Fi rollouts that actually reduce the usefulness of the Wi-Fi or the speed in areas that are less affluent. That's already happening, but we just don't know it because we don't have the tools to test these things or to know. It's really hard. It's kind of invisible. So there's already that inequality. And then also, because of a business need set over something like free Wi-Fi, there's all sorts of censorship that happens too. You know, and that really limits people's rights, what they're able to see, to access.
And just at one point, I mean, there is an arms race here as well. I mean, there always is, in a sense, in the ability to kind of get to market and exploit. My research group has just done a review of 10,000 Android apps, built a bunch of software to kind of download it and look at the internal code to see, for example, where your personal information is being shipped out to, what the third parties that you sign up to, who they actually are. It's an extraordinarily complex and interesting space. And what's also interesting is the extent to which those code libraries are now being obfuscated. They're being literally encrypted so you cannot see. And I think it's an interesting thing for us to try and keep a grip of where we even can have our purchasing levers, our levers of kind of accountability.
Thank you. Ali, quick point, and then we'll go to the audience, please.
Oh yeah, so I was going to talk about auditing and just talk about the idea that, there's an example from the United States where a company put together an algorithm that sort of watches people's workflows at their workstation to determine if they are interested in leaving the job, right? Sort of follows you and sucks up a bunch of data, and it's like, is this person going to leave this work? Because as you know, maybe you don't, turnover is really expensive. And so turnover is something that big institutions have to try to mitigate. So this news came out and it was hugely panned. People were furious. They were like, what an outrage that you're monitoring your workers to see if they're going to leave. And the company came back and said, what's interesting is that most of the time institutions want this because they want to see who are the bad managers. They want to watch and see, is there a group of people who are all going to leave at once? And you say, like, oh, okay, I guess it's a little bit better. And then you might ask yourself, well, why are those people leaving? Maybe they're leaving because their manager is so good that they're all becoming empowered and they want promotions, but the manager isn't leaving, so they have to look elsewhere for another job, right? And so there's these layers of decision making and these contexts that you have to put around each of these examples for you to even get a sense of what is fair and unfair, right? And it's not the algorithm that's going to tell you that. There's nothing in that algorithm that's going to tell you whether or not each of those steps was fair or unfair. It might tell you that it's creepy. It might tell you that it's inappropriate from a privacy point of view. But auditing that algorithm is not going to tell the whole story. And so these layers of context have to be around both. We have an obligation to put them around both when we're using these technologies ourselves to make decisions and using data to make decisions, and when we're demanding transparency and accountability. Context has to be part of the conversation.
It's a really, really great point. Thank you. Really helpful. So I'm keen to open it up to the audience now. If I could ask for sort of crisp questions rather than comments. Is there a roving mic yet? So the gentleman just there. Thank you. What I'll do is I'll take 3 or 4 questions if there are, and then bring it back, please.
Thanks. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Just wanted to underline Sarah's point about how algorithms are offline too, and like institutions, particularly government ones.
The mic closer to your mouth, please.
So institutions, particularly government institutions, are black boxes already, and like maybe we can work on the transparency of them without getting into the code. But my real question is around how can you, if you have an algorithm that's working on some data, like how can you verify that the decision in a particular case is using the algorithm that was published? Like, how can you verify that? We see, like, in the VW case, which we haven't talked about yet, like, you can maybe have published the algorithm, but you have no way of knowing that that's the thing that's actually being run on something. And how might you audit the actual, like, per decision algorithm, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. Thank you. I'll have another question right here, the gentleman on the second row from the bottom. Just that. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm Paul Maltby, Director of Data in the UK Government Digital Service. And I think this is such an important conversation to have, and I'm really pleased to have it with such a great panel. In the UK, we published a data science ethics framework a few months back. It was as a way to try and understand what we should do, not just what we can do. And it's very much a first effort. It strikes me that in this accountability of algorithms, it may not be as hard as we think from the government point of view as a first step. So, for instance, be able to log where we're using algorithms, to explain broadly what those algorithms do, to explain what data they point to, actually might be quite just an important first step that we could actually start to take some action collectively. Myself, I'm not sure whether the always saying that the government's algorithms used in government should be transparent always. We always talk about the fraud and security side, but also just from a sort of an efficiency point of view, like, should governments go and try and develop their own version of a DeepMind algorithm? It seems like quite a waste if there are amazing tools around. We might want to use those tools straight away. And also, it's the training data as well. So the algorithm doesn't make that much sense if you don't also understand what training data it's used. And of course, lots of that will be personal data that we wouldn't want to publish. So I just think transparency is probably not enough. So the question is, if we think transparency on its own isn't sufficient here, what would a form of inspection or audit, particularly in a government space, of algorithms look like?
Great, thanks very much. And I had a question just of that. Yeah, great.
David McNair from the One campaign. A lot of what we've been talking about, I mean, it's been incredible to learn about this. It's highly, highly technical, and for people who want to understand, A, how is a decision being made, B, how is it affecting me, and B, can I challenge that decision, aren't those the kind of three kind of inflection points for people who aren't kind of deep in the kind of technical aspects? And then on top of that, we could have, you know, a set of auditors who could, you know, be kind of trusted institutions that could help with that. But I wonder if the disclosure of code and data and so on is really going to help, you know, the man or woman in the street to understand.
Say the three inflection points again.
So how is a decision being made? How is that impacting on my life? And do I have the opportunity to challenge or question that decision?
Thank you. Yep, great point. Thank you. I probably won't go back again. So last opportunity for any questions. Fantastic. So the gentleman just there, Alex Howard, on the third row from the bottom. Just that. No, hang on. There's a mic just coming.
Just as a general principle, and we can keep this sharp, should algorithms used by public sector organizations be subject to Freedom of Information Acts? I think you can take it in two ways. One, if the algorithm is built by the public sector, should that software be posted onto GitHub or something similar? And second, this is the gray area, if there's some degree of privatization, if the algorithm is used by a private company, should that be subject to audit if not publication? For instance, if in our Federal Trade Commission is looking to see if a company, for instance, a search engine is putting a thumb on the scale for its own company, should it be able to see what's ending up on the first page of results? Or if you're seeing differential placement in, say, a river of news on a social network, should there be insight into whether anyone is putting the thumb on certain kinds of news versus others?
Fantastic. I'm going to wrap it up there when it comes to questions. 4 really good questions, going back to the panel. So the point around, should algorithms by the public sector be subject to freedom of information? If it's a private company being contracted, should they be audited? We had a question on, look, this is really complicated. How do we simplify it? Is it about, you know, how the decisions was made? What's the impact is on my life? How do I challenge it? We had a good question about what would audit really look like in practice, and then a really interesting question, like how do you know whether the decision used an algorithm or not, even in the first place? If I can, I'm going to go to the panel, and at the same time, if you want to take, with the time we have, the opportunity just to wrap up, and if there's one thing that you would like people to go home with today, what would that be? So maybe starting, Gus, since I was unfair to you in my algorithmic decision. Gus, you start.
Just on the inflection points in particular, because I think there's an element to all the questions to it. Let's not forget the 2 additional inflection points. Is there a decision-making process being undertaken? We don't often know that. And what's the purpose? Why is it there? And that needs to be audited before everything else needs to be audited. Why is government making a decision about allocation of resources? Why is a company making a decision about allocation of a service? And are they doing so? And then, is it an algorithm? Is that algorithm actually being used at a moment in time, or is something else being used? Are you being stopped at the airport because an algorithm says stop this individual at the airport, or is it just the security guard doesn't like the look of you? We're getting to the point, if we just jump to the algorithmic decision making, the average individual is going to say, oh, but I'm sure somebody's audited this algorithm, so it's all good, it's all fine and good, as opposed to being able to demand, why are you stopping me? Why is there unequal access to resources in this circumstance? So that has to be the precursor question. But the precursor question for this audience, before we jump to transparency, before we jump to freedom of information, and I get why we do, but just to push you a little bit, the reason why we're here at this juncture with so little understanding of what to do next is because for the past few years, we've fetishized data. And we've said, let's have more data. Let's do more things with that data. And what I actually think we need to start doing, as well as asking why are there decisions being occurring, we need to ask, why is there data in the first place? Where is there no data, and why is there so much data over here? And which data is being used to make decisions, and why is that the case? And what level of control do we have over the actual emergence of that data in the first place? All the examples we used have something in common, and that is, it's not about the data you willingly disclose. It's the data that is generated upon you without any of your involvement. And so what we're going to have if we don't regulate the actual deployment of decision-making, so we'll have decision-making everywhere based on data that's emergent everywhere because we fetishized it so much, it shall be everywhere, and there'll be no accountability even at the top levels of society. That's a disaster we're heading towards until we stop with this fetishization and say, let's focus on the data. Let's focus on the generation of the data. Let's understand that if we don't close off some of this, there shall be intelligence gathering and decisions made that will be opaque to everybody, including government. And that's going to result in a society that's unaccountable.
Hang on, one example. How do we regulate the deployment of data? How do you do it?
So for instance, look at Internet of Things, that's an easier example. Your smartphone. Your smartphone does what you want to do, but it does far more many things. And far more many things that are designed by the manufacturer that you have no insight into. You don't know what sensors are actually on your device. You don't know what data is actually being generated. And following on that, going with Nigel's example, you don't know where that data is actually going to either. But let's just focus on the device itself. Why is there all this data being generated on the device that you have no oversight into? You have no control over the fact that it's actually even being generated. And the reason it's being generated is because somebody somewhere along the chain, the value chain or the government chain, wants to make use of that data at some point. If we stem the creation of that data or assert control over the generation of that data on your mobile phone, it can't then be used against you to get access to a service or get access to a border, so on and so forth.
It's a really hard one. Ali, what's your take?
That was exactly right. I wrote down, when you were naming the inflection points, I wrote down why, not how. Right, so how is the decision being made is something that we keep asking, but I'm not sure that that's really all that productive. Why is the decision being made? What factors are being considered? Who is making the decision? Kind of all the other W words in English might be more applicable. But I do think it's fascinating that the fetishization of data, perfect phrase, this great deep need we have to come up with objective truth, to try and come at something and say, well, what are the facts? What are the facts? Let's collect the data and get the facts. I don't know if this is an expression that will make much sense in international context, but there's a saying that the best model of a cat is a cat, right? Which is to say that as soon as you're extrapolating, you're making something simpler so you understand it, you're choosing what qualities of that thing are the most important. And so even by collecting data, you're developing a point of view, you're creating an implicit answer to your own question just by choosing what data is important. But it's fascinating to think that the reason this all exists is because we as creatures want answers, and we want these answers to be quantifiable. We want to know that we're right in some way. And now that we have some mechanisms, some technical mechanisms to try to get data and try to put that data to work, giving us objective, factual answers, not truly, but in our point of view, sometimes. Now we're like, but how do we know those are factual? Let's get more explanation out of this. Let's get more data about how factual our facts are, right? So the layers of information we want for explanation, I don't know how productive that is in terms of actually getting anywhere. Maybe what we need to do is step back, as I said, and as Gus has said, and question sort of how we're using this information and what values we're bringing to the conversation. So maybe we're explaining the wrong things with the questions that we're asking.
Okay, so Nigel, this is quite a nice lead up. So from an AI perspective, this is fairly existential. I mean, should governments have a legal requirement to not use personal data that's hoovered up by private companies? I mean, should we just have less data? Your last words.
Well, look, I mean, I'm hugely sympathetic to this notion of fetishization, the issue of context, of course. But let me just wave the flag in defense of the scientific method. One of the things that is interesting is in science and publishing is how much fraud is going on and how much work is having to be done to the point at the back to prove that the data that is being claimed actually was A, generated, and B, put through the method in a way that can be verified. So there is a lot of work trying to work out whether you can see the telltale signature of actual non-compliance in some sense. There will be work on that. I think it's important. I think it also speaks to Alex's point about should we be able to FOIA the algorithms that are used in some decision making in government? Yeah, you bet. You won't be able to FOIA the algorithms that some of the surveillance agents, the intelligence agencies are using, I expect, although we can have a fairly good notion of what methods there are there. And of course, the context, the why. My sense in this is that it's very hard to kind of hold back that interconnected, multi-billion Internet of Things world we're going to be in. The thing we have to do is develop norms, regulations and in some cases legislation which holds the barrier for privacy, that actually this is a reasonable expectation to it. Autonomy and privacy aren't things we should be throwing over the fence just because there's a lot of data around. So redress will be the key here. Arguments about why government should be explaining what they're doing and why, and companies, are as material as ever.
Thank you. And right before the gong, Sarah, how do we empower citizens and consumers? Your last words. What do you think?
So a few points on the question. So there's a project recently from Government Digital Service, Registers, which is looking at it's a project to do with the infrastructure of government data, and they've been publishing the history of registers as essentially an audit log of decisions that have been made and why. It's a really fantastic thing on the web right now, and you should all go and look at it because I think it's a glimmer of the future about what some of this transparency could look like and how it could be meaningful for people. Secondly, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, in May 2018, it gives people the right to... Wait, there's the music. Can I keep going?
Keep going for 20 seconds.
Yeah. So we have the right to question an automated decision that's been made about us. And I think unless we see that as a design challenge and look at it from the point of user needs, those kind of rights will just kind of drift into the small print and become more terms and conditions or freedom of information requests that only specialists know. We have to prioritize people and what they need and what they expect to see. And I also think in terms of how we know which algorithms are being used, I'm very interested in general transparency, audit logs, the work that Ben Laurie is currently pushing, trust but verify, being able to have verifiable kind of audit logs so you can have absolutely know which version of an algorithm is being used at any time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Look, thanks so much, everyone. I think it's really key for the open government movement and the open government partnership to not only look at the openness piece, the transparency piece, but also look at the whole data spectrum, to privacy, to personal data protection, to when data should be shared but not entirely open. So thank you for coming here today. I look forward to continuing the conversation. A big round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.